Hello everybody, welcome to Crafty Soup. My name is Misty. I'm here today with a layout process video for the Mixed Media Mayhem YouTube Hop, and here is their logo. We scrap lift an inspiration layout, which is this one from Janet Fritz over at Galaxy Girl Creations, and this is a peek at what I came up with based on that. And I will tell you how and why as we go along. So I am doing snowy photos today, and that's just because I'm working on winter from last year, and so that's what I've got inspired by. And I was mostly inspired by this cathedral window pattern that was on the inspiration layout. So that is where I'm going. Most everything else I'm changing up, but I am going to stick with that pattern and use mixed media with that. So the first thing I'm going to do is create my own stencil. I don't have a stencil with this cathedral window pattern, but I do have a cover plate die. There we go, for card making. So I'm going to do a partial die cutting technique where I keep the die cutting plate off the edge of the die so that it doesn't cut through in that portion of the die. And you can see here at the bottom how it came out. It didn't cut through that section. I am going to save some of these inner bits for using on this layout and for other projects as well, because they're kind of snowflakey star-like. So I will save those. Now the second portion of this partial die cutting is to realign that die with what has already been cut, and then finish cutting a second length to this. So I'm elongating the die as well as getting that pattern to repeat, so that when I'm using it as a stencil, I have more area to work with and it's easier to kind of get a larger area with it. At first, I put my cover plate on with the partial covering towards the opening of the machine, and that was not sucking it in very well. And I don't do a lot of partial die cutting, so that was an experience I hadn't had before. So if I turn my plates around so that the full sandwich is going into the machine first, that worked better. And here you can see I've just elongated my die into a nice long stencil. Now I'm going to play with these Dino Wakley scribble crayons. I have never used them before. They are brand new to me, and I'm going to show you a little bit of my process that I went through with these. I had some ideas about how to use them, and nothing was working. The first idea I had here was to just draw through them as a stencil, and then I was going to rub out the pattern to give it a lot of blur, but the pattern wasn't staying strong enough. So then I was wetting my pencils because it is a water-soluble medium, and using it wet through the stencil, as well as wetting my background paper so that I could get more blur but still have that pattern. Now you can see some blur, but the pattern is still too harsh. So I take a step aside from that, and I'm just going to do kind of a watercolor mix here with scribbling on the background. I will spray it down with my water, and then I will dip that, what was going to be a stencil, into this paint, and it's going to become a focal piece on my layout instead. Part of what I'm having trouble with here is that the water is diluting the pigment too much. So I shift gears a little bit more to keep trying, to keep playing. I've got some watercolor paper. Before I was working on Bristol, and I thought, well, the watercolor paper releases the color a little bit better than Bristol. And so as I'm rubbing on this, my watercolor paper starts pilling up, which I haven't had a problem with that before. So I shift gears again and I go back direct to paper, but I do wet it down first as I'm scribbling, so hopefully that would let the color release better, but you still get those scribble marks on the paper. So I think, what am I going to do? I'm going to set the experimentation aside here because none of it is coming out how I wanted. I'm going to go back to some tried and true techniques, and I will go back to experimenting with these a bit later. I mean, like I said, these were brand new to me. You saw me open them and play with them for the very first time. So sometimes it takes more time to get used to a new medium, and sometimes new mediums aren't for you, but a little bit later in this video, I show you something that I did go back to and started working towards. Now, as I've been chatting, I have been working on the base of my layout. I am gutting out this pattern paper. I'm going to layer it on top of this blue snowflake pattern paper, which I just wanted that tiny border edge of the snowflake since I am doing snowy photos. This is my tried and true technique where I just add wet pigment onto my wet paper for a wet on wet technique, and normally I would do that with a brush and watercolor, but here I'm using my finger as the brush and these scribble sticks as the watercolor medium. So this is something I'm totally comfortable with doing, and actually using your finger gives you a little bit more control over the saturation of the pigments, so that was kind of nice, and I could more densely saturate it in some areas and lighten it up in other areas, and giving it a spritz helps the edges just kind of feather out a little bit. And then I will go ahead and add some spatters, taking the paint or the pigment directly onto my paintbrush from the pigment stick and adding it that way. Now I kept with, of the 3 blues that I was working with, the darker blue ended up on my front piece here, so I kept the background with mainly the other 2 blues. Now, I pulled my piece back out, and even though it was a stencil and then it was a main focal piece, I am putting it back into stencil mode here and hoping that I don't ruin it, because I had another idea. When I was spattering those pieces, I thought, what if I spatter through the stencil, because that would give me a blurrier version, which is what I'm kind of looking for. I wanted a blurry version of this pattern. So I go ahead and grab my materials, and just like I was doing before, I pick up the pigment directly with my wet paintbrush and I start spattering around, and I will peel that up. I did use a non-porous tape for this, and then the pattern wasn't there. I tried spritzing it. It still didn't work. But then I thought, oh, what if I go ahead and use this stencil on an already wet background for my spattering? And so I go ahead and reposition it and spatter it, again, hoping that I don't ruin my focal piece there. And when I look at it, it's okay. And this starts giving me what I'm looking for. I will pop up a close-up here on the screen, so I hope you can get a vision of what I'm thinking of. I do need to go ahead and set that aside and move on and play with it more later, because I just don't have enough time to get through all of this. So I'm going to save that tape. I try to save supplies as much as possible to reuse and repurpose, and I'm moving back along with my layout. Now my border paper has some brown and gray tones in it, so it does have blue berries on it as well, but when I trimmed it down, those blueberries aren't showing up quite as much. So I do want to bring in brown and gray to my background so that I can pick up on those colors a little bit more. And then when I'm adhering watercolor paper to a background, I like to do a full border of adhesive and then an X through the middle of the adhesive. And I find that that helps kind of solve most of the warping problems that you get from mixed media papers. And then with this focal piece that I'm doing here, because it is being glued to the watercolor paper, which has a bumpy texture, I do use liquid glue and pressure. So I will go ahead and line that up how I want it, and then give it a roll with the brayer to really help adhere things down. And that finishes off the mixed media portion of my background. So you can see the inspiration piece versus my piece, and what I picked up on from the inspiration was just that pattern. All right, now it is time to get a design for this layout. Usually when I start a project, I will have a layout design in mind of, positioning of photos and whatnot. This time around, I just started with the mixed media, so I've got to come up with how I'm going to fit all these photos onto my layout at this point. So I trimmed down that focal photo, and then I was just going to make rows of these photos, and because all of the small photos didn't fit at the bottom, I put one at the top. And then I realized this, well, first I realized that my photos weren't the same size because my printer is printing things crooked, and so when I trim them out, the photos end up being crooked. So I'm going to trim off excess, negative space in the photos that I don't need there. But as I'm laying out these photos, I realized these 3 photos are part of all the same kind of story of the overall layout. And so the other 2 photos are just kind of fun photos. So I put those together up at the top, and I put the 3 that match up story-wise down at the bottom. And that gives me a solid layout for this. And then one of the other things I noticed about the inspiration piece was that it had a bit of a diagonal flow to it. There was some visual triangle stuff, but there was a little bit of diagonal stuff as well. So I'm going to go with some of that diagonal flow, and I pulled out a bunch of embellishments, and I set aside an alpha set that didn't have enough letters to spell out a title. So I found an embellishment that says, "'Tis the season to be freezin'." And while I don't usually use embellishment word pieces as my title, I'm doing it this time because it was very appropriate. And you can see I'm just experimenting with various areas of embellishment, and I'm realizing I need to make sure I've got room for my journaling, which I'm going to put down there on the right, and that will end up being part of the diagonal flow of embellishments that I pick up with this. I do really want to get these snowflakes in here, but the color of them are just, it's a little bit harsh for this layout, so I will end up setting those aside. And what I do pull out is some kind of vellum stars that have a snowflake print to them. So that is a compromise there that I will work with. And most of these embellishments, I think, were from a hip kit club from years ago. I am doing a little bit of stash busting here as well. And you can see me pulling out those various stars. If you like this idea, you can always die cut vellum and then color it with any color medium, like using a brayer and an ink pad across the vellum. Totally works to color vellum, and then you could stamp snowflakes on it. So there's a way that you could make those yourself if you like them. I do put the date in some tiny glittery letters off to the left of my photo. It'll just be a subtle addition over there, so it won't detract from that kind of diagonal flow that I'm trying to get here. And this is where I make my final decision on eliminating those snowflakes and definitely sticking with the stars. I also have these glittery tags that I wanted to stick in there. Just, it wasn't fitting. So moving on, I did really want to get these wintry creatures on here too, but yeah, it wasn't fitting. And I try adding in more stars, and I just need to step back and let it be simpler. It's okay. I don't have to put everything on one layout, which I tend to want to cram a lot of stuff on. So I put my journaling on to make sure that I get that in there before I, use up that space with other stuff. And then I decide, yeah, I need to quit. So I'm going to top off this layout with those little kind of diamond-y star shapes that were the inner die cut pieces. And that finishes off this layout. I did dip those in a little bit of the watercolor left over, so it did give them some color and texture. And I'm calling that layout done at this point. I hope you enjoyed something about this layout process, either the experimenting with new media or shifting gears when things aren't working. Whatever it is you might have gotten out of this, I would appreciate a thumbs up if you did find something useful. So next week I have just one video for you, and it is that supply stretcher video that I've been hinting at in the last few episodes here. I hope you will come back and join me for that, and until then, I hope you have an artful day.